welcome to the Week 10 edition of the Fantasy Football Brothers podcast. My name is Blake, and I'm here with my younger brother Carson, and we're officially halfway through the 2021 season. How you feeling?
That's crazy. I would say time flies, but it feels like the season's been going on for a while, and I'm happy that we still have half left because I love fantasy football. So I'm excited.
All right, well, let's get right into the Week 10 buys. We've got the Bears, the Bengals, the Texans, and the Giants. So really, we've got a few fantasy-relevant quarterbacks that are kind of fringe, I would say. With the Bengals and Joe Burrow, and the Giants having Daniel Jones, Justin Fields.
Exactly.
Well, okay. We can go ahead and talk about it. I'm not too impressed. I'm not too impressed yet.
No, agreed. But it's definitely a vast improvement from what he used to be, at least passing. Like the fact that he had, I think it was 290 something.
291.
Yeah, 291 passing yards. Like, that's kind of a big deal for him, for how he was eased into this offense, like, not throwing the ball at all. Do I think he's like a proven player yet? No, not at all. Probably not for the rest of the season. I think he might have potential of being a good quarterback in the NFL. And it's just good to see that he has this glimpse of hope, this glimmer of hope. I picked him up because week 12 he plays the Lions on Thanksgiving, and I have Kyler, and he'll be on bye. So I'm like, maybe that could be a decent play with what I have left to even potentially start. So that was my thought process. But yeah, I don't think you're all in on him, but it's definitely an improvement.
No. Well, here's my thing about it. He still hasn't had a game where he's thrown more than one passing touchdown.
Yeah.
And as long as that's the case, he's going to be like, obviously his running is going to help him, but we're thinking more about the Chicago pass catchers, like this offense. If they're not scoring touchdowns through the air, it's going to be, the usual suspects of David Montgomery and not much else. So I'm talking from like a team fantasy perspective. I'm still not in on Justin Fields because he just hasn't gotten it done with through the air.
Agreed, but just seeing like passing yardage totals and completions, him individually, he's got such a great floor if he can get his passing under control because of his rushing ability. And I think he's already making improvements. But as far as the rest of the team's fantasy value, I think that they're all much worse than you expected going into the season or could have hoped for. So
yeah, and it's not like he doesn't have talented pass catchers.
Correct.
You've always maintained the belief that Allen Robinson is an underrated wide receiver.
For sure.
And coming into the season, I know he was top 15 at the position. I want to say even top 10. But yeah, it's similar to the Eagles and Jalen Hurts. How Hurts has standalone value, and then everyone else in his offense kind of suffers because he's not a very competent thrower yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. I did read something, though. I think this is honestly ridiculous. I think that Justin Fields is like QB3 between the past 2 weeks, which is just weird. Once we're done with the buys, we can talk about just how weird this past week was in general. But... Well,
in standard scoring, Jimmy Garoppolo is the best QB in the past 2 weeks. So
I was going to mention that later. Yes.
Yeah, it's been a fluky stretch of games where the players you expect to deliver for you have gotten lost. So, yeah.
Move on to the Bengals.
Obviously Joe Burrow and talented pass catchers. I think Tyler Boyd, after one catch for 6 yards, I think he's got to be. I feel like you can drop him and be okay about it.
I think you got to be okay with it, honestly. If you can find a more reliable waiver option, you're always going to be kicking yourself seeing him post, high double digits or high teens, low 20s. But I just don't think you're not going to be missing his performances where he literally gets one catch. Like, this is the second time he's had that this season. So
he's been so boom or bust.
Yeah, agreed. It's tough decision, but you just can't rely on him.
Yeah, no doubt there. But obviously, Jamar Chase is a big loss for teams, and Joe Mixon did get 2 touchdowns, so I mean
Yes,
he'll be missed at the running back position.
for sure. These are definitely like must-start players at their respective positions.
Yeah, Giants, you were already missing Saquon, so not really much there. The pass catchers have been banged up. There's not a lot of relevance there. And then with the Texans, you're missing Brandon Cooks, and well, how about that game from Tyrod Taylor, huh?
That's awful. Like we thought he would be a good DFS play, but an awful return for him. 3 interceptions, 0 passing touchdowns, 5.9 fantasy points against, you know, the Dolphins team is like not good at all. I don't think they're. I mean, their passing defense isn't like awful, but overall this should have been a good matchup for him. So that's a little disappointing for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hopefully with the bye week they can maybe get a little bit more comfortable in the offense. He has had very few games starting for them this
Yes.
year, but you got to think that, and I don't know off the top of my head. I'm gonna look at it real quick. They face the Titans next week,
Yeah.
so obviously that was not an easy matchup by any means for Matthew Stafford, and I definitely believe in Stafford more than Taylor.
Yeah.
So maybe not a bounce back opportunity, but you got to expect better than 5.9.
Yeah. Agreed. Guess we can move on to the Thursday night matchup: Ravens Dolphins.
Yeah, speaking of Dolphins, right?
Yeah.
We're going to go ahead and start with the Ravens, the away team. Lamar Jackson had a very solid outing,
Yes.
30.64 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns through the air, as well as 120 rushing yards on 21 carries.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a good game. I mean, that's not too bad for a running back, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So with this particular matchup, as we were talking about, Miami ranks bottom 3 in total yards allowed, and Lamar does it all. He throws the ball and he runs, so that's a
Yeah.
good statistic for him. And then in terms of the running backs, Devonta Freeman is a popular waiver acquisition. He had 13 carries for 79 yards, and Le'Veon Bell, 11 carries, 48 yards, and a touchdown. They both had double-digit carries, but we've seen both of these players find the end zone. I'm not really confident starting either one if I can avoid it. How do you feel about them?
I think you trust Freeman more than Bell, but I agree. I don't think that uh, in a committee environment for this backfield, along with just Lamar Jackson being the quarterback, I don't think you can ever have a reliable RB1 on this offense if they're splitting carries like this.
Yeah, I think the real issue is that there's just not one player that's kind of like has the talent to break away from the committee. I
Yeah,
think that's where they are right now. I mean, they're rolling out Freeman and Bell. Like these are guys that 3-4 years ago that'd be like, wow, what a stacked backfield.
yeah,
But now in 2021, these are like guys that are kind of towards the tail end of their careers. It seems.
yeah, and it should have been young guys if it wasn't for their injuries. It should have been Dobbins and Edwards, but they had to
Yeah.
revert back to some veterans. So, um, yeah, it's interesting, but yeah, you can't trust them.
Yeah, and then with the pass catchers, Marquise Brown had another good game, 9 catches, 116 yards, and Mark Andrews struggled a little bit. He had 5 catches, 44 yards, still got you 9.4 fantasy points, and he is currently tight end too. So I mean, that
Yeah.
speaks to the. I mean, obviously he had a 40-point game earlier this season, but it just speaks to how shallow the tight end position is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in almost any other position, you can't afford to have like a week where you bust and be ranked that highly. He's definitely carrying his own slack with that one performance, but it does show you how shallow the position is for sure.
Yeah, and then kind of an odd cast of characters who caught Jackson's touchdowns. Devin Duvernay, Devontae Freeman, that one doesn't surprise you so much, but then Patrick Ricard, their fullback, each caught a touchdown from Jackson. So I do expect one of the main two guys, being either Brown or Andrews, to get one this week. But maybe Rashad Bateman gets involved. He had an okay game.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's more room for Bateman in this offense, and I definitely do think you trust Brown and Andrews to return the value that they have of being just very solid plays. I agree with that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Dolphins. Jacoby Brissett stepped in for Tua, who had a fracture in his middle finger on his throwing hand, so he couldn't really play through that. Uh, I think this injury kind of snuck up on the Dolphins because
Yeah.
technically Tua was still active for the game, and he would only be brought in an emergency situation. But I mean, the idea that they didn't bring, they didn't elevate anyone from the practice squad, like it was just those two quarterbacks that were available to them, and I thought that was kind of unexpected.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I feel like it took me a little bit by surprise. And it's weird that it seems to have taken the team by surprise a little bit too, because I mean, I was hearing a lot of fantasy analysts saying that like Tua would be a very kind of a priority QB fill-in pickup for last week, and then just all of a sudden he's out. So yeah, that's definitely interesting.
Yeah. So Brissett got you 8.5 fantasy points roughly, and that's not very good.
No.
The good side is that Baltimore ranks 31st in passing yards allowed, and that's around 282. Uh, if Tua is unable to play, you have to lower expectations for the offense overall, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And then Miles Gaskin, we saw, he's been seesawing in performances, high, low, high, low. If it's any indication, next week is going to be a low matchup. He was super inefficient. He was averaging under 2 yards per carry, but he had a rushing touchdown and 6 receptions that kind of saved his day. Otherwise, it's a bad matchup. Baltimore ranks fifth in rushing yards allowed, under 100, and again, like I said, he's going back and forth on bad and good games, so I think
It
there might be
fits.
some.
It fits the bill for
It's
this week
fitting.
to be a single-digit scoring game for Gaskin.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't be surprised. And then with the pass catchers, Will Fuller, he's ruled out. Oh, he was ruled out for this game on Monday, so the timeline for his return is still uncertain. And then it's the usual suspects yet again, with Devontae Parker on IR, Jalen Waddle, and Mike Gesicki are the two pass catchers that you want in this offense. 16.3 fantasy points for Waddle, 9.4 fantasy points for Gesicki. Oddly enough, he's tight end 3, so we're going to have two top 3 tight ends in this
Yeah.
matchup. But, I mean, I don't know. I think that I think it really comes down to if Tua's available, if
Agreed.
with my confidence level on these guys.
Yeah, I'd say more Gesicki if this game had anything to say about it, but definitely for both of them, it hurts their value if Brissett's playing over Tua.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about Saints Titans. So the I don't think it's necessarily a guarantee that Trevor Siemian gets the start this week. And we watched Tennessee play a really inspired performance against the Rams on Monday Night Football. What's your confidence level in Simeon if he starts, and what's your confidence in Taysom Hill if he starts?
I don't think Simeon. I mean, Simeon filled in against the Buccaneers in Week 8 very well, just for that scenario, but I don't think he has any fantasy value at all. This team's missing all of their top options other than Kamara. You'd probably feel better with him if he had that like safety blanket with Michael Thomas. So I don't feel great about Simeon, fantasy wise. But Taysom Hill, I think you gotta trust him just because of his versatility, the little Swiss knife as they call him, Sean Payton's son. I just think that he gives himself such a high floor with the plays they designed for him, and he is talented. Um, so I think for fantasy, I think he has way more fantasy value than he does NFL QB value. I guess I compare him to Jalen Hurts to some degree. So I would definitely feel better about Hill fantasy wise than Simeon.
Yeah, I agree with that. We'll have to monitor that situation going into the weekend. Otherwise, Alvin Kamara, like you said, is the only guy you trust in this offense. Tennessee is a tough defense. They're inside the top 10 in rushing yards allowed, and that will limit him as a rusher, which he's gotten a lot of usage this season, but his usage in the passing game is going to keep his floor high. He had 7 targets in week 9. I think if it's going to be a pass catcher in that offense, it's probably Alvin Kamara, because who else can you trust?
Yeah, nobody, unless OBJ goes there, but that probably wouldn't factor in for this week. But Kamara and Eckler, I guess I'll make a comparison. They're just so unique in such an elite tier with running backs because if they're not getting it done on the ground, they just become a wide receiver. So,
well, I think you're forgetting McCaffrey in that conversation.
Well, yes,
of
course.
I totally agree.
McCaffrey's on his own level, but yes, he is definitely in that same conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. On the Titans, Ryan Tannehill, I'm done with this guy. I'm telling you right now. 19 completions, 27 attempts. I get it. I get that the Titans defense were dominating that game and they were giving the Titans a short field to work with on several occasions. But this guy had 143 passing yards, 1 TD yet again, and 1 interception. And then he had 2 rushes for 3 yards and a touchdown. Finished with 14 fantasy points. This is his 3rd game of the season with under 200 passing yards, 1 or fewer passing touchdowns in all but 2 games. He's got 4 rushing touchdowns on the season, 1 last week, but you can't count on those. I feel like you have to drop this guy. If you are using him in a 10 QB league, like a 10-team, 1-quarterback league, I feel like you got to drop this guy.
Yeah, I do agree to some degree. I feel as if you have a quarterback that you will almost never bench, maybe keep him. But like it's week 9, so this is kind of the outlook I had from 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and he still hasn't proven it. So I think I wouldn't bat an eye if someone dropped Tannehill.
No, and the stat that is most glaring to me is he's got 1 or fewer passing touchdowns in all but 2 games. Like,
that's awful.
That is horrible. I mean, that's
for someone that doesn't get it done on the ground. That's awful. I mean, other
right,
than his
who
touchdowns,
doesn't get a lot of rushing
yards.
yards.
Yeah, I just mean yardage.
Yes, exactly. He's got 4 rushing touchdowns, but yeah, he's not putting up rushing totals that inspire you. He's got 2 games on the season with 0 touchdowns or passing touchdowns. I mean, this guy, I don't understand what his problem is, but Derrick Henry's not there, so like throw the football, throw some touchdowns. I'm tired of it.
Yeah, I mean, you almost would have liked Tannehill more with Henry gone fantasy wise, just because it would have forced him to get it done through the air. I'm curious to see what will happen when they're not facing the Rams. Like, I mean, the Saints defense is not a pushover, but I guess I don't have any hope, and it's just sad.
No. Carson, the Saints are the best team against the run.
They're good. They're great. Yeah. No, it's another bad matchup. He's not going to prove himself.
Yeah. So, talking about the running backs, you can't feel great about any of them, really, because of that stat alone. Adrian Peterson had some flashes, I'll say, in especially in the opening drive. He made Aaron Donald miss in the backfield and stumbled forward for a couple yards. But I mean, really, outside of that, I didn't see a lot that I was super impressed by. Not that I was expecting a lot from him. I mean, he's definitely he's a true veteran. He's going to be a Hall of Famer. But I think that the Titans they're working with a committee. They've got Jeremy McNichols. Jeremy McNichols, who had 7 carries for 24 yards. He got you 6.5 fantasy points. You had Dante Foreman, who had 5 carries for 29 yards.
Is that like a long-lost brother for Devonta Freeman?
Yeah, it's an off-brand Devonta Freeman, I think.
Yeah, I can't believe this team is 7-2 and just beat the Rams.
Well, you got to remember they had the best, not only the best fantasy football player, but also just the best running back in the league that was dominating. I mean, when you control the game on the ground, you can win a lot of football games.
It's true. Just show that Derrick Henry's value in fantasy and in the NFL.
Yeah. And then for the pass catchers, it's kind of like Justin Fields. It's kind of like Jalen Hurts, except you don't like the upside as much with Tannehill. These pass catchers are suffering because of their quarterback's inefficiency. So they each got less than 10 points, 9.2 for Brown and 7.5 for Julio. You got to lower expectations for these guys, and that means a lot more for A.J. Brown than it does Julio at this point of the season. But New Orleans ranks fifth in points allowed per game, so I do kind of expect, although we were very surprised by the Falcons last week, I do expect the Titans to kind of struggle again.
Yeah, I agree. It's unfortunate to see. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but like AJ Brown was in the conversation of like draft night with Justin Jefferson and DK Metcalf, and he's just getting so hurt by this offense. So
yeah, very much so. All right, we can move on to Bills Jets, and I'm gonna do this very briefly because I think it was very fluky that Buffalo lost to Jacksonville 6-9 last week. I don't anticipate back-to-back off games for Buffalo. And the Jets rank last in total yards allowed per game and points allowed per game. So I think the Bills bounce back. I think they probably bully the Jets, who are going to be led by Mike White. That was confirmed today. So, I mean, on the inverse, this is like the best facing the worst in terms of specific statistics. Yeah. Buffalo ranks first in in passing yards per game allowed, under 200. They rank first in total yards allowed per game and points allowed per game at just 14.8. You got to lower expectations for the Jets, but I mean the cards are stacked against them.
Yeah, I just can't believe the Bills got lucky enough to face the Jaguars and Jets back to back, and yet they didn't capitalize on both of them.
Yeah, they may only come out of it 1-1.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I will. You don't have any notes on this, but I'll just ask you: like, do you, real brief, do you buy Elijah Moore's production at all, or like how would you evaluate his value?
I'll tell you this: his value is directly tied to as long as Zach Wilson is not playing at quarterback.
That's fair.
Because that offense is abysmal with Zach Wilson at quarterback.
Yeah.
It can be Mike White. We've seen it be Josh Johnson. Like, these other guys can support this fantasy offense a lot better than Wilson can. So as long as Wilson's out, I have, pretty positive hope for players like Elijah Mitchell to be fantasy relevant for this team. But as soon as Zach Wilson comes back, man, it's grim.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a fair reason to have doubt in him, even though he was probably one of, if not the most or highest picked up player this past week on waivers. It might not be a long-term look for him because of Zach Wilson's imminent return, not this week, but probably soon.
Yeah, and I think did I say the wrong name?
I don't think so.
Mitchell?
Yeah.
I feel like I said... Wait.
Elijah Moore?
Moore, okay,
yes,
that's right.
You're thinking of the San Francisco running back. Yes, two Elijahs that have emerged this season.
Yeah. So, the one thing about Elijah Moore I do like is his matchup next week. They're playing Miami and then Houston the following week. So, if by some luck, the Jets can avoid having Wilson start those two games, I do like his prospects in weeks 11 and 12. But that's kind of a hope and a prayer at this point.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's talk about Lions Steelers. All right, we've got pretty much two players on the Lions that are worth any consideration. That's DeAndre Swift, who's currently RB9 on the season. His receiving numbers have kept him a borderline RB1 on the season, as we just said. And Pittsburgh ranks in the top 50% in all defensive categories and 9th in points allowed. So I think you got to lower expectations for Swift in a tough road matchup against Pittsburgh, but he can have, he can have 6, 7 catches, and that will kind of keep him afloat. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. I think what makes this matchup though difficult, because as we've said before, like Swift just always gets it done fantasy wise because of how that offense operates, just always getting him involved. But a very overall strong Steelers defense doesn't make you too happy, because the versatility of Swift is what makes him unique. But if he's not getting it done rushing, they can't just pivot to passing and have a ton of success against this defense. So I agree that you should be lowering expectations on him for this matchup.
Yeah, and then the other one to consider is T.J. Hawkinson. He has been a double-digit scorer in 3 straight games, averaging just over 10 targets per game in that span, but he's limited in touchdown upside because Goff has thrown 1 touchdown in his last 4 games combined.
I was unaware of that statistic. That is awful.
Yeah, I was talking about this a couple weeks ago. Jared Goff stinks.
Yeah, he's Super Bowl quarterback.
Yeah, Super Bowl quarterback. Yeah, Super Bowl losing quarterback, we'll say.
Yes, Patriots.
Yeah. So anyway, to the other side of this matchup with the Steelers, I just got word prior to recording this that Chase Claypool is week to week with a toe injury, and initial reports were fearing that it was going to be season ending, which is very intense. Yeah. But fortunately, that's not the case for him. But he is likely to miss this game. So we'll just go ahead and we'll skip over Najee for a moment. We'll talk about the pass catchers. Deontay Johnson had a pretty quiet game. Yes. 5 catches for 56 yards. He had 2 carries for 11 yards. Finished with 11.7 fantasy points. But the reality is that he's a double-digit scorer in every game that he's played in. Detroit ranks 14th in passing yards per game allowed. So, obviously, he's still the pass catcher you want in this offense. But let's talk about Pat Freiermuth, who I mentioned in our DFS podcast. If you played him, it obviously turned out well for you because he had 5 catches for 43 yards and 2 touchdowns for 21.3 fantasy points. I mean, what can we say about this guy? He's got his targets in his last 3 games are 6, 7, and 7. He's got 3 TDs in his past 2 games. Are you buying his production as a reliable option week to week moving forward?
I think you are, especially if this news of Claypool, because he'd be getting more targets if he was to be. I mean, he's for sure going to be out for, I would say, a few weeks with that analysis or prognosis. But regardless of that, I still think you feel good about Freiermuth. I mean, especially in tight end leagues, as said before, if you can get a tight end that's not
leagues that require a tight end,
if you can get a tight end that's not TD dependent but still gets touchdowns, that's just like amazing. I think you buy Freiermuth's production.
Yeah, the targets are there, and the crowd is loving it every time he makes a big play. They all go Muth.
Do they really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's
pretty cool. All right, let's talk about Jaguars Colts. Trevor Lawrence, he should be okay to play. He did finish the contest in Week 9, so no real concerns there. And then James Robinson should also be back this week. Now, it is not the best matchup. Indianapolis ranks 14th in rushing yards allowed per game and 15th in points allowed per game. So, not the best matchup. I do feel better about him being there than Carlos Hyde. And then, can you trust any of the pass catchers in this offense? I mean, here's a stat for you. Dan Arnold, the tight end, led the team in receiving yards with 60, catches with 4, and fantasy points with 10. He was the top fantasy scorer on the team.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous, and I think that means you can't trust any pass catchers in this offense, and it's sad because I love my boy Laviska Shenault. It's just crazy. I looked back and I saw that we're about to talk about Pittman, but I drafted him before Pittman, and that just shows you how crazy preseason projections can be. But I mean, it's like when DJ Chark went down, you're like, wow, okay, Marvin Jones and LaVisca Chenault are going to have even more value, and then Dan Arnold just stepped in. Like, it's really weird.
Yeah. I will say, if you are playing in a league with that requires tight ends, Dan Arnold is someone to look at.
Yeah.
He's been good. The Jaguars traded for him earlier in the season, so obviously they liked what they saw from him. I'm going to pull up his stats really quickly, if I can. So in his past 3 games, he's had, or let's say after the bye, because that's a better example. 8 catches for 10, or sorry, 8 catches on 10 targets for 68 yards, 4 catches on 7 targets for 60 yards. He's been a double-digit scorer in back-to-back weeks. I think the touchdowns are certainly an opportunity in this offense because, they do throw a good amount of times, but the issue is just that you can't really trust any of the main pass catchers, it seems, as of late.
Yeah, I agree. It's just weird to think that Arnold could be carving out a path for him to be relevant, but I think you gotta trust it until it changes. I mean, I don't know, with the given variables of Chark being gone this offense, I think you have to trust Arnold being relevant, or at least somewhat
Yeah.
relevant, because I don't know what else could change that could make you feel worse about him.
Yeah, and the bar is so low for tight ends anyway, so just a consideration. Let's talk about Colts, who last Thursday had a bit of a shootout with the Jets. Carson Wentz was 22 for 30 for 272 yards and 3 touchdowns. He got you 24.18 fantasy points. Jacksonville ranks 26th in passing yards allowed per game, 24th in total yards allowed, and 25th in points allowed. So, is there any reason we should not expect Wentz's hot streak to continue?
I think it at least should. I mean, the Jaguars held Josh Allen, but no, I think that's just a weird performance for the Bills. Wentz has had some great matchups. I think you do trust him this week. Um, I know you probably think this is ridiculous, but I heard that a different manager in our league, Carson, a different Carson, was thinking about starting Wentz over Russell Wilson this week. Do you think that's too high on Wentz? I mean, obviously that's because it's a tougher matchup for Wilson and it's his first week back, but how do you feel about that potential decision?
Um, I think it's probably a little foolish.
Yeah,
A little bit. I mean, Russell Wilson has much greater upside. I'm going to pull up Wilson's previous stats. I mean,
there is some reasoning behind it though, but I do think
no, of
that
course, of course, but I think like with the rushing upside that you see more so from Wilson than Wentz, and I think that Wilson has more weapons on his offense. I would probably disagree with that.
yeah.
Um,
But it's
but
crazy to think that we can even have that conversation. Obviously, there's variables about Wilson coming back from injury, but they were in a bad QB situation. They picked up Wentz, and it really paid off for them. And I think it will through this week too.
yeah, I mean, really, it is up to him because it's his team. Like, because what do I know? I'm only first in our league, but hey, that's besides the point.
Okay. Okay.
I just had to squeeze that in there real quick.
Yes.
So let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. His streak of excellence is continuing. I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. Personally, he had 19 carries for 172 yards and 2 touchdowns, as well as 2 catches for 28 yards. He got you 34 fantasy points. You love to see that. He's been a 20-plus point fantasy scorer in 5 of his last 6 games. He does have at least 1 touchdown in all of those games. And he even has a game this season with over 100 receiving yards. So he can do it all when the offense or when the defense gives it to him. Do you think Jacksonville, ranking 12th in rushing yards allowed per game at 103, is going to slow down Taylor?
No, I literally do not care. I think that Jonathan Taylor, it's just crazy. We talked about this a little bit on the Thursday night recap episode, but it's crazy to think that the first few weeks of the season you were disappointed where you drafted him, and now you are elated.
Yeah, really
It's
punch in the air.
it really shows the dominance of Derrick Henry that he is still holding on to the RB1 position rank, but it's about to be Taylor's, I think, because he's
Yes,
currently two, and that's just
correct.
I mean, it's just you're so happy that you have him and that he's paying off because he kind of teased you a bit at the beginning of the season, thinking that he wouldn't, but he's definitely legit.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that given that we've seen him be successful in the passing game, that even the tougher matchup, a bit of a downgrade in that perspective from the rushing point of view, I still believe in Jonathan Taylor to be a top 5 running back this week.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, on to your boy, Michael Pittman Jr. 5 catches for 64 yards and a touchdown. He got you 17.4 fantasy points. He had 6 targets in Week 9, 5 TDs in his last 5 games. You like to see that. I do expect one more good performance, like at least a top 20 performance before Week 11 when they travel to Buffalo. I think that the Bills are probably, they're still one of the best defenses in the league, and I do kind of expect them to slow Pittman and Wentz down a little bit.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I think that it's going to be, obviously it's slowing down Pittman because of this, but I think it'll be more about slowing down Wentz because I think Wentz has a really good connection with Pittman. So he might get the looks he needs if he can capitalize off of them. That's a different discussion. But Carson Wentz, I mean, in that Week 8 performance, he was just forcing it to Pittman every chance he could. Again, I do feel like that Bills defense is just. I don't think they can allow a receiver to have double-digit receptions.
Yeah, we'll see. If Dan Arnold pulls down 20 fantasy points, we'll maybe look at him a bit differently. But yeah, and then with T.Y. Hilton, you got to monitor his injury status with a concussion. I don't feel super confident starting him if he's active in this matchup. I just think that he really needs to prove that he can finish a game healthy before I feel good about putting it in my lineup. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, he hasn't completed a game without injury this season, right?
Yeah, I mean, and in fairness, it is a good matchup for pass catchers, but he's just been. I mean, he had, like you said, like we've said, he has not finished a game healthy this season.
I think you gotta have better options than him. I wouldn't be surprised if he has a good game, but I don't think you'd really be kicking yourself by benching him.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, let's move on to Buccaneers and the Washington football team. Carson, let me ask you this. Do you know the record for single game passing touchdown?
I do not. I'm a guess that it's 7.
It is 7. Multiple players hold that record. Would you be surprised if Tom Brady broke that today or this weekend against the football team?
Oh, I mean, that'd be so beautiful. Honestly, I used to not like the Patriots, probably just because they were your favorite team and I was the little brother and always seeing them win. But seeing Brady just do this amazing at his age, you just have to root for him, honestly. So I would love that.
Yeah, that would be amazing, especially in our 6-point passing touchdown league.
Oh my god!
I could probably guarantee my victory off that alone.
I mean, he would have 42 points if he literally threw no yards, just the touchdowns, which is literally impossible. But that's ridiculous.
Yeah. So
probably a little bit higher than what he'll end up doing, but it is certainly a good matchup.
Yes. I mean, it's the best matchup in terms of passing yards. Yes. Washington ranks last in the league, allowing over 286 passing yards a game, and they rank 29th in points allowed, 28 points. They're giving up touchdowns week after week. So this is you're licking your chops if you're the Bucs coming off of a bye, and Washington coming off of a bye too. But I mean, these are just two different teams, really. We're seeing
100%.
So as far as I'm concerned, the players you're starting, Tom Brady and Mike Evans for sure. We'll talk about the other pass catchers in a moment, but Leonard Fournette, the only thing that the football team has any sense of competency in, I'm not sure that's a word, but they rank 11th in rushing yards allowed per game, still over 100, but even with that, Leonard Fournette is he's proven himself to be a reliable pass catcher in this offense. So I think you lower expectations a little bit. Maybe the rushing total isn't as high as you've seen, but I think that he can certainly still find his way into the end zone, and he's liable to catch a few passes this game.
Yeah, all I'll say about Fournette is just like the analysis we're doing, and I completely agree with your saying, just the analysis that we're doing at this stage of the season. Going into this season, you would have thought that us talking like this must have meant that Ronald Jones was injured. It's just so weird how this backfield has ended up operating.
Yeah, that's totally true. Fournette could fumble the ball, and then what do you know? Ronald Jones is out there. But I do think that I definitely don't. Here's what I'll say: there's no possible way you could see yourself starting Ronald Jones unless you're just in a league that has like 32 people and every player has to be started.
Then maybe, yes, maybe.
Yeah, maybe then you're like, oh, this is my week with Ronald Jones. But no, I think it's Fournette's backfield to play with. We've seen that throughout the season, and all I'm saying is that the football team is pretty good at containing the run. So lower expectations a little bit, but he's still probably going to be a top 20, if not 15 running back. And then we've got 3 injuries to monitor. I do know from a little bit of research that Chris Godwin came up with a foot injury this week, but apparently nothing serious, according to Bruce Arians. So if he's available, I'm starting him. I have him in my team, so I'm hoping he is. Antonio Brown is less likely to start. He has maintained that ankle injury and still has his walking boot on, so that one's a little bit more risky if he does clear to play. So we'll monitor that going into the weekend. And then Rob Gronkowski with his back, I think if he's available, watch for reports on Sunday morning like we saw last week where it was said that Gronkowski would kind of be used in emergency situations. And he really was. I mean, I think he only got like 12 snaps or something in the game before he was taken out.
Yeah. It's I for the same reasons that you're rooting for Brady, I'd like to see Gronk out there with him.
Yeah, let Gronk catch a few of those 8 touchdown passes and it'll be a good day all around.
Yeah.
All right, and I know, imagine that the football team wins this game, because after all this talk that we've done, but we do have to talk about them. They do have some fantasy relevant-ish players. I'll start with the obvious one, Terry McLaurin. He's a single-digit scorer in 3 of his past 4, but he is averaging over 9 targets per game in that span. Is he going to bounce back, do you think, against the 20th ranked defense in passing yards allowed per game?
I think so. He had a good game in week 8, correct? Or no?
That would probably be the case, considering that he was single digit in 3 of the last 4.
Yeah. I'm kind of back to trusting him, and I think this is a good matchup. So I agree that I think he will do well.
Yeah. So he had 7 catches on 12 targets for 122 yards and 1 touchdown. This was actually in Week 7 at the Packers.
So what did he do against the Broncos in Week 8? I just do not remember that at all.
3 catches for 23 yards.
Yeah. I don't know. The Broncos defense apparently has been insanely good lately. But it's crazy, though, whenever teams go on bye, you kind of forget, like, how have they been doing again? But, yeah, I do trust McLaurin.
Well, Week 6 against the Chiefs, 4 catches for 28 yards.
Yeah, that's a more worrisome statistic.
So
you're not benching him.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
I just think that what do you expect from this week?
I think you just cross your fingers and hope, because I don't think it's really a decision that you can make, because it'd be extremely bold to bench McLaurin. I mean, we've talked about players that you can relegate to your bench, but it is a little bit annoying whenever very fantasy relevant players go on a cold streak, even if it's not their fault. It's just very annoying because you have to start them because they're just proven. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah, so let's talk about the running backs for a little bit. Antonio Gibson, he's also a single digit scorer in his past 3 games. He has been playing through a stress fracture in his shin, and I know that can't be pleasant. So hopefully the bye week helped him recover some more. But the reality is that Tampa Bay ranks second in rushing yards allowed, and that's not good whenever Antonio Gibson doesn't catch a lot of passes. So, what's your expectation of Gibson? You think he's going to have another single digit game?
I do. Um, kind of everything I was saying about McLaurin is the opposite for Gibson. Uh, Even though it's hard to trust this offense in general, I just like I feel like you can bench Gibson, which is ridiculous. I guess I
Yeah,
kind of
would
sound
you
like a
rather?
hypocrite with what I was just saying with McLaurin. Like you can't bench him, but when they're they should be fantasy relevant players. But I don't think Gibson has proved himself at all this season.
That's not entirely true. He has had a couple good games, but it's all been touchdown based.
Okay, yeah,
So,
I'm looking at it now. Ever since week 6, he's been on the struggle bus.
yes.
So
And
since our show started, I guess maybe that's why it feels more like that then.
right. Yeah, I mean, he has had some good games in the season. I mean, he's only been 20 plus one time, but I think the matchup definitely scares you in this one, and his injury concerns are still lingering as far as I know. So if you're starting a Washington running back, I think it's got to be J.D. McKissick, who, assuming game script plays a factor, that he'll probably see the field a little bit more than a typical. I mean, the football team is always usually losing, so they're always kind of a negative game script, but you do expect McKissick to be a little bit more involved because Tampa Bay's only real defensive weakness is in their passing, in the pass defense. So, yeah, if you're going to start a Washington running back, I feel a lot better with McKissick than Gibson. But, I mean, I get it if you have to start him, but just, you can't expect a whole lot unless he falls in the end zone.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, and then 2 pass catchers to monitor: Curtis Samuel with his groin injury, and Logan Thomas, who is not officially off of IR with his hamstring injury, but in the 3 games that he has played, he had 12 catches on 14 targets for 117 yards and 2 touchdowns. So let me ask you this. If, let's say, both of these players are available and they're off the injury report come Sunday, are you willing to start either of these guys?
In a tight end league, yes, for Thomas. Samuel, no, in almost any circumstance, unless it's a real emergency because you're somehow extremely unlucky with buys. I don't trust Samuel. I want him to start getting some good games in. But Thomas, I think you can trust that in your tight end spot. It will be
Okay.
interesting, though, to see what Seals Jones' involvement is like in this offense with Thomas back, and if that detracts from Thomas at all, or if they can just
Yeah.
coexist.
Yeah, I mean, I could totally see RSJ taking a few snaps away from Thomas and kind of lowering his value. But yeah, that'll be something to monitor. And like I said, he's not even officially off of IR yet, so this is pure speculation that we're talking about.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Browns at Patriots. So on Monday, Nick Chubb and Demetric Felton both tested positive for COVID 19. Both players are vaccinated and therefore require 2 negative tests 24 hours apart to play. The only instance that we've seen a player test out of the COVID protocol was Zach Ertz, really early in the season.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily have high expectations that either of those players will be available. And that's unfortunate because I just traded for Nick Chubb last week. Obviously, it paid off. He had a
Yeah.
great game. But if I'm without him this week, and among other fantasy managers, that's kind of a big blow because he's been a very consistent, very reliable running back when he's been on the field.
Yeah, I'll ask you in sort of relation to this: is Dearness Johnson essentially a must start if both of these running backs are out?
Yeah, he is, but it's not a good matchup at all. New England ranks ninth in total yards allowed per game and fourth in points allowed per game. So it's gonna be, it's not gonna be as easy as when they played Denver.
I think yes. I
That
think it was Denver.
Yeah, that was when Johnson got his first start, and I think they kind of just, it was a Thursday night game, so really anything can happen in those. I think that, yeah, I think the Patriots are a better defense than the Broncos, if I'm being honest, and I'm trying to stay unbiased, but I really do believe that, and I think the stats may back me up on that. I'm not 100% certain.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the Broncos' defense has gone better since that performance, but at least with how they were that week, I would agree.
Yeah, either way, like pretty much anyone, whoever plays in this Browns backfield is going to be a touchdown dependent option, I
Yeah,
think, given the matchup.
agree.
All right, and then with the pass catchers, let's start with the one that people have been, most people have been starting when he's available, and that's Jarvis Landry. He had 3 catches for 11 yards, and without Odell Beckham Jr. there, that kind of is a concern. But Mayfield only threw the ball 21 times, completed 14 of those, and it was just a blowout at the Bengals. I mean, 41-16, I believe, was the final score. So, how are you feeling on Jarvis Landry?
Yeah, I mean, you don't feel great about his first game without OBJ, but it was also kind of like a short turnaround from the news of him leaving the team, so that could have some impact. I think that people should not be dissuaded from trusting in Landry just because he didn't do well in that first opportunity without OBJ. I think he's a safe play in this offense, just because I think he's definitely going to be getting the targets. And I mean, I feel very similarly about his outlook. I feel better about him, but just as far as like the targets got to go somewhere, we can move on to Donovan Peoples-Jones. I feel like
Well,
that's
yeah,
why he
and
also is got to be becoming a somewhat safe fantasy option.
yeah, and just to go back on Landry for a brief moment, the targets have been there. He's averaging more than 7
Yeah,
targets in his past 3 games. So Mayfield's definitely looking to him, but I think that, again, New England is 11th in passing yards allowed per game. So it's a tough matchup all around, really. I mean, not to brag, but New England's looking pretty good. I'm
yeah.
I'm, I'm kind of hopeful for their future. And there's a report out today that OBJ, that the Patriots are making a strong push to sign him.
No.
That
I
is
mean,
true.
I read that he wants Packers, Chiefs, Saints.
Well, might have to
But
be
maybe if he
suiting up
gets
with the red, white, and blue.
yeah, maybe if he talks with Bill, that could all change.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be
That would
very
be interesting.
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be exciting, I would say, because it would give Mac Jones, and we'll talk about the Patriots in a moment because that's the matchup in this game, but it would give Mac Jones definitely a very proven wide receiver and someone who has a lot of talent, probably more talent than anyone else on that receiving core. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll follow that. I don't know, but that's just what I read prior to recording. So that kind of got me a little excited as a Patriots fan. But we can move on. Let's go back to DPJ. In the absence of OBJ, that's Donovan Peoples-Jones. 2 catches for 86 yards and a touchdown. He finished with 16.6 fantasy points. He has shown to have success when OBJ is absent, and for the foreseeable future, that is the case. So I think he slots in as the wide receiver 2 in this offense. He's got 3 straight games with double-digit scoring. I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, but you're feeling confident with DPJ moving forward, right?
Yeah, I don't think that this means that you need to start him, but he's definitely worth a spot in your roster. And again, like we said, this is not an amazing matchup, but I feel like he will have a handful of good performances in the time left in this season.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, so let's officially talk about the Patriots now with their running backs, Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson, both in the concussion protocol. You don't like to see that.
No.
And it's a very similar situation to Cleveland's running backs in that it's a tough matchup. Cleveland ranks third in rushing yards allowed and total yards allowed. So it's going to be two really good defenses against two kind of average-ish offenses. I think that if Harris or Stevenson or both are not available, then gosh, I mean when you get past those two guys, it gets kind of dicey, and I wouldn't be jumping to pick someone up to as the starting running back for that offense. Just given the way that the Patriots utilize their running backs when it's not someone that they can rely on like a Damian Harris. So if that's the case and both are unavailable, I'm going to be in a tough spot because I'll be out of Chubb and Harris on my personal team.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a situation I would try to avoid if I could.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, isn't the next person up Brandon Bolden? But agreed, I don't feel great about him.
Yeah, Brandon Bolden and J.J. Taylor are like the next two guys, and
yeah,
I mean, you don't feel great about either one. So
no, none of those are like. I don't think. I just don't feel like the Patriots, in my memory of playing fantasy, have ever had like that handcuff guy. I just don't think they ever have.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's been, I mean, Burkhead and. I mean, if you want to go back, like there was LeGarrette Blount, who was great, but yeah, I think that in terms of there being a super reliable week after week starter, it's been LeGarrette Blount and then now kind of Damian Harris, who's, I mean, he's still getting splitting touches with Stevenson, but that was only because he was in the concussion protocol. So
yeah.
That being said, let's talk about really the two relevant-ish Patriots pass catchers, and that's Jacoby Myers, who had one catch for 8 yards, and Hunter Henry, who caught another touchdown, 2 catches for 19 yards. So I'm going to start with Henry. He's got 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games. You think he's going to add to his touchdown total this week?
I sure hope not, because it disappoints me seeing him do that every week. It's somehow an even more unreliable version of Robert Tonyan from last season, where he was on his incredible TD streak, but he was getting more than, I don't know, the receptions needed to match the touchdowns. But he was a similar play. I don't like it. I'm so glad we've moved away from tight ends. We say it every week. Yeah, that's really all I have to say about it. I see Henry find the end zone and not Myers, and my heart hurts.
Yeah, this week 9 where he had 1 catch. That was his first game with fewer than 4 receptions. I feel like this game will be, week 9 rather, will be an outlier because he's been fairly consistent previously.
Yes. He only had 1 less catch than Donovan Peoples-Jones, and look how different their totals were.
Yeah, it can come at any given play.
Yeah. I do think you trust him, though, more for the future. I guess we're ready to move on.
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right, Falcons, Cowboys. Last week, week 9, a very surprising win for the Falcons against the Saints, and a very surprising loss for the Cowboys against the Broncos. So this will be interesting. Matt Ryan was 23 for 30, 343 passing yards on 2 touchdowns, and he added a rushing touchdown as well, good for 28.52 fantasy points. This is Ryan's 4th 300-plus passing yard game, and this season he's done pretty well statistically. 15 touchdowns, it's not an absurd amount, but only 6 interceptions. You don't feel, I mean, it's not awful, but, it's not bad. Cowboys defense ranks 25th in passing yardage against. They allowed Bridgewater to put up a somewhat decent day against them. Do you think that Matt Ryan should be rostered in almost every league? I guess I should say, like as a reliable QB2.
So I'll say this: Matt Ryan in our league, 6 point passing TD he's position ranked 16. So is he rosterable in every league? I wouldn't say necessarily yes to that.
Yeah.
But I think that, we just saw what Bridgewater did against the Cowboys last week. Had a pretty good game. We know that Matt Ryan he's certainly capable of putting up points. I think he did it again. We just covered that he did it against the Saints, which is a tough passing defense.
Yeah.
So I think that he is certainly a bye week fill-in option this week.
For
I
sure.
feel pretty good about that. But yeah, outside of that, I think there are probably better options out there, and you probably roster them already.
I do agree. With that, I guess we can move on to the running backs, Cordell Patterson and Mike Davis. Cordell Patterson 9 carries for 10 yards. Mike Davis 9 carries for 13 yards. So both of them are extremely inefficient on the ground, but this is the real difference between them. Mike Davis only added 1 catch for 5 yards, while Patterson added 6 catches for 126 receiving yards. I think that, this is just more of the same of what's been happening this season. If Atlanta can't get it done on the ground, Mike Davis is completely left out to die, basically, while Patterson has a big day. And it's just crazy. I read something I saw on Twitter today that I think that Patterson's ADP in drafts, average draft position in this season, was wide receiver 78, which that's another added funny aspect to him, and he's currently like running back 7. So a position change and a much higher fantasy ranking. He's just so versatile, as we talked about. I mean, he's not like Kamara, McCaffrey, or Eckler, not even close, but he has the similar abilities where if one aspect of his game or one aspect of the offense is not working, he'll just explode on the other side through passing. So I think that you trust him, and I don't know, what do you think owners of Mike Davis should do? I mean, he's had some good weeks recently, but overall he's had a very underwhelming season.
Yeah, I think that Mike Davis is pretty much unusable because his ceiling is about 10 points and his floor is about 1 or less.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how can you justify, you've got to have better options at flex because he's certainly not an RB2. Yeah, I think Mike Davis belongs on your bench, if not just kind of floating in the waiver pool.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't look at anyone funny if they dropped him. This is Patterson's backfield, and even when they don't get it done on the ground, it's still going to be Patterson through the air. So, yeah, I think that Mike Davis is pretty much fantasy irrelevant at this point.
Yeah, agreed. We can move on to pass catchers. Russell Gage, even after his extremely strange performance where he had no targets in week 8, was he healthy? Because I looked at the app and it was just dashes. It wasn't zeros, but that's just because he literally didn't have any looks.
Yeah, that's correct. He was on the field. He was playing.
Ridiculous. But
he suited up for that game, but he didn't do anything.
yeah, but this is what you probably would have expected from him in Calvin Ridley's absence. Gage led the team in targets with 8. I would say that this is probably a performance that will happen a lot the rest of the season as long as Ridley's out. Would you agree?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because I think that whenever he had 0 targets in week 8, I think that any player that is worth having on your team should never go untargeted. I think that you understand what I'm saying.
A little bit, I guess. Continue explaining.
So yeah, so I think that when you see a player like him not get any targets in a week that they're down
Yeah,
Calvin Ridley,
it's true.
and it's projected that he's going to be the leading, receiver in that offense, and he ends the day with 0 targets. I mean, that's somebody that if you start them, you're you have to be willing to get burned by that choice. So for me, I don't think he is a priority waiver pickup like you have in the notes here, because he's already proven to me in 1 week that he was completely irrelevant to their offense. So if you're desperate, I get it, but you have to face the possibility that he could burn you like he did in week 8.
Yeah, I agree with
I
that.
wouldn't.
Someone,
Here's the other part is that I wouldn't expect consistency from Gage.
I agree. I do agree. I think he might be worth rostering, but the fact that he did nothing in this offense in the same situation, you don't feel amazing about that.
Right.
Could be a different conversation in a few weeks, but yeah, I don't think you're. I agree with that. Someone that I think should become more reliable is Kyle Pitts, who only had 3 receptions for 62 yards. Pitts saw 7 targets, caught 3 of them. Like I said before, Pitts was bound to regress from his weeks 5 and 7 performances where he had huge plays that allowed him to boom. But I do expect Pitts to be more reliable than this on a week-to-week basis than he was in week 9. And this Cowboys defense is relatively middle of the road, and they're easier to pass against than run against. So I think that makes you feel good about pretty much everyone we're talking about because they all have receiving versatility. One thing I do want to say before I move on to the Cowboys, just looking at week 9, like the top 10 scoring wide receivers, it was an extremely strange week. Olamide Zacchaeus, is that how you pronounce his name? I think that's
Yeah, I
right.
believe so.
He was wide receiver 4 last week. I don't buy his production. Only 3 catches, but 2 of them were touchdowns. Someone on the Cowboys, very similar stat line, Malik Turner, 5 catches, 2 touchdowns. These are 2 players I don't really trust, but it just shows you how weird last week was to just see both those type of players explode. I just
Yeah,
wanted
it
to
seemed
mention that
like
because it was a
it
weird
seemed
week.
like yeah. Watching last week's games, it felt like every time someone was scoring, it was like, who is that guy?
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that those are aberrations, not something to expect week to week.
Yeah, and I have a few players that are very big surprises that were in this top 10 scoring wide receivers in week 9 that we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, just strange week. Just wanted to mention that. Cowboys, though. Dak Prescott, 19 for 39, 232 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and an interception. As I said before, Broncos unexpectedly dominated the Cowboys. So I'll ask you, did Denver successfully exploit Dallas's weaknesses, or was this more of a fluke for this offense?
So when you're asking me that, what are their weaknesses? Because their offense is high powered.
So how are they stopped?
Fluke.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
I mean, I think that's the case. I mean, we know that these players are all fantasy relevant. I mean, even down to the tight end, Dalton Schultz, who
Yeah,
didn't have that terrible of a game for tight ends.
I know. Getting them as a
But
team I have to write notes for, I know that I'll be writing about them for a while because they have so many fantasy relevant options.
yeah, I mean that's what I mean. Like they have top 15 or top 25 at every position. So I'm not. Yeah, I think that this is a bad game. They laid an egg, but I think that especially against the Falcons, they have a great opportunity to bounce back.
Yeah, I do agree that they're bound to bounce back. I will say something that's interesting. It might be more noise than news, but I just think it's interesting that Dak has had more sub 300 passing yard games than 300 plus passing yard games this season. Um,
I mean, well, considering the pace that he was on last season, I would agree
yes.
with that. But you have to keep in mind that it's not easy to throw for over 300 passing yards every week.
Yeah.
Like very few players do it, and it's like I mean, I think in this season, I think it's like Brady and Derek Carr are your two top uh, passers in the league, and so
Yeah.
like I'm gonna look up Brady as we talk about the rest of Cowboys offense, but like even I'm looking at Brady's stats right now, and he's got one, two, three, four. He's only got 4 games of his 8 that he's played that were over 300 yards. So I'm not too concerned about Dak, and I'm not too concerned about the rest of this offense. I think it was just a bad week.
Yeah. So I'll swiftly move through the rest of the players because I do agree they all had pretty subpar weeks in week 9, but I do expect them all to bounce back. Pretty much all the people I'm talking about. Zeke had 12.6 fantasy points, so he didn't do awful, but not great. Only 3 games this season with fewer than 15 fantasy points, and 2 of them have come from the past 2 weeks, but I expect him to bounce back. And the Falcons defense ranks 23rd in rushing yardage allowed per game at 123.1, so I expect him to get a better workload. Um, Dallas only rushed the ball 16 times in week 9, so I just expect him to improve from there. CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, and I'll just throw in Dalton Schultz too. All of them, none of them did amazing. Schultz actually did the best out of all of them. But these are all players. I mean, I guess I'll ask you, how do you value Schultz in this offense? I think Michael Gallup is set to return this week. With Lamb and Cooper, those are players who are starting every week, and I expect them to bounce back. But Schultz has been interesting. Do you have any confidence in him?
I do. I think that he's proven himself in this offense, especially considering at the beginning of the season that it was kind of a split between him and Blake Jarwin. But Schultz has kind of proven himself that he's a reliable pass catcher. I don't know off the top of my head how many touchdowns he has. Probably not too many, maybe a couple. He's
Yeah.
had some pretty good weeks. And then, considering that he's a tight end, the bar is so low. Yeah, he's got 3 touchdowns on the season, 2 in 1 game back in week 3. But I do think that even with the addition of Gallup coming back, I still think Schultz has a feature in this offense that I'll continue to use as long as my pass catchers are banged up in my own personal team. But also, I
Yeah,
think that for leagues that require a tight end, Dalton Schultz, there are worse options.
for
He's
sure.
he's tight end 6, so I mean, that's something.
Yeah, and even though the Saints surprisingly did not pull out a win against the Falcons last week, you got to remember that this Falcons defense, is relatively weak, and they rank 27th in points against a game at 26. So I expect this Cowboys defense, or Cowboys offense rather, to definitely bounce back. We can move on to the next game I'll talk about: Panthers Cardinals. I'll start with Christian McCaffrey real quick. Respectable return for him. Obviously not a McCaffrey day because I mean I think he was even projected 22, even though he was set to be on some sort of a snap count. But I mean he just
Yeah,
showed his versatility.
that was never gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean the fact that
he,
you're almost
he,
disappointed
he
with McCaffrey. Go ahead. Go ahead.
well, he got about like 49% of the snaps, so he played less than half of the game.
Yeah, and
From
still
that
had
perspective.
14.6 fantasy points. He's just
Yeah,
extremely talented.
yeah. There's no doubt that people who drafted or managers who drafted McCaffrey have been missing him, and he's coming back at a good time. Hopefully, you've maintained a respectable record in that time, so that you can utilize McCaffrey on your run to the playoffs. But I think that they're gonna reintroduce him the right way. They're not trying to re-aggravate his injuries. So I think that you can feel confident as long as they continue to manage his injury correctly that he's going to be a reliable asset to your team once again.
Yeah, agreed. So, I guess my analysis changes a bit now that there's news that Darnold will be out for multiple weeks. Does that make you feel better about DJ Moore?
It has to. It can't get
Yeah,
worse. PJ Walker is slated to start presumably the next 4 games at least because Sam Darnold is expected to miss 4 weeks and being placed on IR. So yeah, PJ Walker is the new guy in the offense. It can't, like I said, it really can't get worse for these pass catchers. Maybe we'll finally see Robbie Anderson emerge. Who knows? I
could
mean,
happen.
that guy has been, I'm sure he's been dropped in a lot of leagues and rightfully so, but maybe with a new quarterback at the helm, who knows? I think it can only go up from here.
Yeah, I mean, Darnold's performance in Week 9, 172 passing yards and 3 interceptions. It's got to go up from there. That's really all I have to say with this Panthers offense. It'll be interesting to see what PJ Walker does for them. But the Cardinals defense
Yeah,
is very strong, so that's a tough game for him to come into. Cardinals
agreed.
defense is ranking fourth in total yards allowed. Total yards allowed a game at 321, and second in points against a game at only 16.3. They are easier to run against than pass against, but I mean, McCaffrey
So
can do
good
it
news
also.
for
It doesn't even matter.
McCaffrey. Yeah, good news for McCaffrey, but
Yeah,
I think
overall
you
this
lower
defense is
expectations all
difficult.
around.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Talk about the Cardinals. Don't have a ton of notes for all these people, but they do have a ton of fantasy relevant players, just like the Cowboys. Kyler Murray, monitor his injury status this week. Would it just be pure speculation, or do you feel like he has any chance of playing this week?
Well, he himself, and obviously you have to take a player's word with a little, a grain of salt of some sorts, because obviously they're going to want to play. They're going to be optimistic about themselves. But Kyler Murray said today that he made crazy progress on his injury, and so he expects to be available to play if there's truth to that and he gets cleared. Obviously, that's a boost to this offense.
And it'd be a boost to my fantasy team as well. So I'll be holding out hope. But
Certainly.
I mean, Kyler Murray to some degree is matchup proof, but this Panthers defense is very strong against the pass, only being second in passing yardage allowed a game at 181.4. That's very low. But I mean, Kyler's versatility, you got to still feel pretty good about him, and you're not benching him if he's active.
Yeah, I would say this. If Kyler starts, I would be a little concerned about him running too much,
Yeah.
considering it was an ankle injury. So that might be something that kind of you have to keep in mind. You lower expectations a little bit because it is a tough matchup, and he's coming off of an injury. And this is all if he plays. It's still possible that he may miss another week.
Yeah. Yeah. Chase Edmonds got injured during the Week 9 game, and he's expected to miss multiple weeks with a high ankle sprain. So that opened the door for James Conner, who was the highest scoring player in fantasy in Week 9. Had 40.3
sense.
fantasy points, 21 rushes for 96 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 receptions for 77 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. Conner boomed in Edmonds' absence from most of the game last week, and he is non-QB, of course, but the league leader in touchdowns, which is just ridiculous. Do you think that Conner is a must-start running back in Week 10?
Well, considering that he doesn't have to compete with Edmonds for touches, you don't love the matchup, but we have consistently seen that Connor is the guy towards the goal line that gets those carries and delivers on them. So yeah, I think he's an RB1 this week.
Yeah, I agree. I think I read something. Oh, I don't remember the exact stat, but it was like goal line carries. He has like 8, and he's converted 7 of them. It was something ridiculous like that. Like he only had 1 at that range that he did not convert for a touchdown.
I mean, you don't get to have 11 touchdowns in 9 games played and not be consistent and reliable.
Yep, it's true. DeAndre Hopkins, your team's picking up a lot of injuries, I'm realizing. Unfortunate for you, you have Hopkins. Monitor his injury status this week.
Well, actually, formerly had Hopkins. I traded.
Oh,
he was involved in the
yeah.
Nick Chubb trade.
Totally forgot. So now he's Noah's problem.
Someone else's problem. That's right.
Yeah, but you got a COVID guy back for him. So
Yeah.
But yes, monitor Hopkins' injury status this week because obviously he is extremely fantasy relevant if healthy. And I think you also need to be monitoring like all of the pass catchers' injury status this week because Christian Kirk, 16.42 fantasy points. He got it done in Hopkins and Green's absence. Kirk led the team in targets with only 6. But I guess I'll ask you, so keep in mind that this was Hopkins and Green being out, but
Yes.
do you think, I mean, we've been talking about this every week and it's very hard to project. Do you think Kirk is the next best pass catcher on this offense after Hopkins? Because Rondale Moore has kind of fizzled out to be honest. And
Yeah, it's certainly not Rondell Moore, and we've talked about that in the past. But I do think that it's more of a conversation between Kirk and AJ Green. I think that given their game logs, we'll say that AJ Green's been the more reliable option in that passing offense beyond or besides Hopkins rather. But it's still kind of up in the air if Green will be available this week. So if that's the case and he's missing another week, and if Hopkins misses another week, then you got to be excited about having Christian Kirk on your roster, despite the matchup.
I agree. I think he is a very safe option with, I guess, other pass catchers being banged up.
Yeah, that's the thing is that's kind of one of the reasons that encouraged me to trade Hopkins was just, and we talked about it all season long, that this Cardinals passing offense has so many mouths to feed. So it's kind of created a touchdown dependent Hopkins that we're not used to seeing. So I think that as long as people are injured and there are other players that kind of have to pick up the slack, those players are going to have success because of the efficiency of the Cardinals passing offense.
Yeah, I agree. And just using the same analysis and applying it to Zach Ertz. Unfortunately, we kind of hoping that this move would have revitalized his career. But as far as fantasy, it hasn't. He's still a touchdown-dependent tight end just because of all the mouths that are needed to be feeded in this offense.
Fed.
So, yeah, fed. I knew that didn't sound good. Panthers' defense has been strong this season, as we've talked about, ranking second in total yards allowed per game, 293.1. So that's very low, and sixth in points against in each game, 19.4. But they are much easier to run against than pass against, which could be great for James Conner. We'll move on to the next game.
Giddy up.
Yes. Vikings Chargers. Kirk Cousins, 17 for 28, 187 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 1 rush for 1 yard for 1 rushing touchdown. I'll ask you.
QB sneak.
Yes, because you do have Cousins. I'll ask you: is Cousins a low-end QB1, or is he still just a reliable QB2?
Well, I think he's a great bye week fill-in. I used him last week when Brady was on bye, and obviously I was satisfied with the results. He got it done with his legs. He got it done with his arm a little bit. Not too many passing yards, but passing touchdowns help in our league. So I will say this. I think that the Vikings, Dalvin Cook had a pretty good game this week. You can't complain with 110 rushing yards, but I think we've seen more this season than maybe last that the Vikings are passing a lot more, and I think a lot of their offense goes through their pass catchers, Jefferson and Thielen. So, yeah, I like the weapons he has around him. Their defense is not horrible, so it's kind of a good overall situation for the Vikings. I think Cousins is he's a borderline, I'll say top 12, just to kind of hedge my bet a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds good. You mentioned Cook having 110 rushing yards. You can't complain about that. I'll find a little bit of a way to complain about that. Respectable fantasy day for Cook. Not disappointed with his point total, but it was disappointing because he started the game with a 66-yard run, and Kirk Cousins also just stole a rushing touchdown from him. But overall, you still feel really good about Dalvin Cook, and you feel good about this matchup because the Chargers defense ranks last in rushing yards.
You love the matchup. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's very exciting for managers of Cook, yourself included. This should be a game where Cook, I think he probably cashes in probably twice, and for touchdowns. Dream. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised to see him have a 2-touchdown performance. And then we can talk a little bit about the pass catchers that I already mentioned, but kind of quiet days for both of them, despite what their fantasy points say.
Yeah, Jefferson lucked out by finding the end zone. Cousins only completed 17 passes. He was efficient with them, but yeah, Jefferson was lucky to find the end zone. Thielen was not as lucky. Thielen was tied for the most. Well, Thielen did also find the end zone. It was just like on 6 total receiving yards and 2 receptions, so it didn't actually help his
Mm-hmm.
day or salvage anything really for him. But Thielen was
Well, that's
tied.
6 points.
Yeah, Thielen was tied for the most targets at 7 with Tyler Conklin, someone we've talked about a bit in the past. But as I said, it ended with a very strange stat line. So I'll ask you, is Conklin worth picking up in leagues that have tight ends as a reliable option?
Yeah, we're seeing consistent targets coming his way, and you know when you're looking at tight ends, that's kind of what you have to base your decision off of. If you don't have a Travis Kelsey or a Darren Waller or a Mark Andrews, like these guys that are outside of that top three, top four at the position, like yeah, you're looking for who's getting a lot of targets and who has the opportunity to cash in on those. So yeah, Conklin's a good option if you're in need of a tight end.
Yep. I feel like we've really pinpointed tight ends. This I guess you could say this season, with our show. But it's kind of easy to do. You just find someone who's getting looks, and they're going to emerge as a good option at that position. It's a testament to how shallow the position is. But hey, I'm glad that our analysis is actually like paying off ahead of the time, and we're predicting things correctly.
Yeah,
I guess
we've had a few success stories in terms of tight ends with Ricky Seals Jones. I think was the first, and then
Yes.
Pat Fryermuth, and we've talked about Dan Arnold recently. So yeah, Conklin too. Like if there's anything that we can pick so far, it's tight ends, and that's a very worthless. I think that's a pretty worthless thing to have under our belts, but
Not for DFS, but in general,
it's
agreed.
something. Yeah, it's
Agreed.
something.
Chargers defense, as I've said before, really good matchup for the run, but they are not a bad pass defense, so keep that in mind when you evaluate these Vikings players. But we'll move on to the Chargers themselves. Justin Herbert had a nice bounce back game. That was good to see, proving that he's a quality QB1. 32 for 38, very efficient. 356 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns, and he also found the end zone on his through his legs. So that is great to see.
Wow,
From Justin
32
Herbert.
catch or 32 completions. So Mike Williams probably had like 10 or like 15 catches, right?
Yeah, you'd think that, but he had two.
Oh,
Yes. Second most targets on the team, but that was only 5. So Herbert really spread the ball in this game. But one player he did really like was Keenan Allen, who, this is where all the receptions went to. 12 receptions for 104 yards. Allen had his best fantasy game of the season and led the team in targets of 13. So it was basically just like Keenan Allen's day, and then anyone else that Herbert could see, because Mike Williams did not capitalize that like you were leading into. This is Keenan Allen's third game this season with 100 plus receiving yards. And I guess I'll ask you, because this is the opposite of the question we asked previously. Is it safe to say that Allen has surpassed Williams in this offense?
well, Mike Williams has definitely been on a difficult stretch. We'll say a disappointing stretch. I'm not really sure how to make sense of it. I think that obviously they're throwing a lot, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but Austin Eckler only had 3 catches this game. Like that's like unexpected for this offense. So I don't know. I Mike Williams has kind of been this way in the past, but we saw it with such consistency at the beginning of
Yeah.
the season. That's what inspired the question of, has he surpassed Keenan Allen in this offense? And at the time, it certainly looked that way. And now at this stage in the season, I think the opposite is becoming true. That Keenan Allen is the wide receiver that you want. But we've seen that Mike Williams has that ceiling this year, so it's kind of one of those things where you have to start him week to week until, I mean, at some point you're going to want to stop if he continues to do poorly. But I'm not certain what the real reason is that he's on this stretch.
Yeah, it's disappointing for people like Williams, who are probably so happy to have him with where they drafted him and riding high, and now he's kind of regressed a ton. So it's
Yeah,
disappointing.
the reality is that he was drafted extremely late, and so from that perspective, you kind of have to take what you get.
Yeah, it's true. You mentioned Eckler kind of had a subpar day by his standards. Still had 11.2 fantasy points, so not like a dud, but disappointing for him. But he does have a double-digit floor, honestly, just because of his versatility, as we've talked about before. I guess the last part I'll talk about Jared Cook, 4 receptions for 48 yards, and I think he must have caught a 2 point conversion because he had 10.8 fantasy points. So even though he didn't score a touchdown this game, I'll ask you: is Cook a touchdown dependent low end tight end one?
Pretty much every tight end in the league is a touchdown dependent low end tight end one.
That is very fair.
Yeah, we've talked about this in the past that Jared Cook, he's been not very good this season. He's got multiple games under 30 receiving yards. I'm counting 4 games under 30 receiving yards. So, yeah, if he doesn't score a touchdown, his ceiling, or I suppose his floor, is very low. Both ceiling and floor are pretty low for Jared Cook. So I'm not too eager to pick him up this week.
Agreed. I agree with that. I will say something I skipped over for Eckler. This might be a game where a lot of running takes place because the Vikings defense ranks 30th in rushing yards allowed a game at 136.6. So both of them have very lackluster run defenses. And this
Yeah,
Vikings defense, go ahead.
two running backs. Sorry, just to say that two running backs in Cook and Eckler that you might want to consider paying up for at DFS.
Yes, that is completely true. And this Vikings defense overall is relatively weak as they rank 27th in total yards allowed a game at 383.6. So I feel like this will be a pretty productive day for both offenses. It should be a high scoring game.
Yeah, I expect it, especially with how the Vikings have had so many close games this year. They've gone to overtime multiple times, which increases the opportunity for fantasy points. I do expect high scoring on both ends of this game.
Agreed. Move on to the next game. Seahawks Packers. We talked about Russell Wilson a bit earlier when talking about Carson Wentz. Wilson's set to make his return from his finger injury that had him left out since week 5. He averaged 22.39 fantasy points in weeks 1 through 4, and I would say that he's got to be a must-start QB. Would you
Unless
agree
you
with
have
that?
Carson Wentz.
Yeah,
Unless you
Carson
have
Wentz is the
Carson
only guy that
Wentz.
can trump him. But honestly,
Yeah,
he's
no, I do.
Carson
I
Wentz
think
is
that,
just like a really good QB2. I doubt you have someone better than him as your next option after Wilson.
No, I like Russell Wilson a lot, and I think this Packers defense is. I mean, they have contained Mahomes and Murray in the last 2 games that they've played, but I mean, just it's kind of the way that the Seahawks are. They rely on Chris Carson, who may be returning this week, a lot, and they also have big playmakers in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So, I I'm not afraid to start Wilson in his first game back this week.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You hinted at Carson could make his return from his neck injury that had him left out since week 4. I believe he practiced in some capacity today, which is the first time he's done that in weeks, so that's good. Chris Carson averaged 14.67 fantasy points in weeks 1 through 3 where he played. So I would say that you've already kind of hinted at it because this offense relies on him. You feel confident starting Carson if he's active. Would you agree?
It depends.
At least
It
maybe as
depends
a
on
flex.
his. Sure, I think that certainly if he's falling into your flex, that's okay. I think that it depends. The fact that he is just now beginning to practice after such a long stretch is a little concerning, but he is a talented player. He is someone that they rely on, like I said. So, I think probably maybe lower expectations a little bit for his first game back, but yeah, I'm okay with you starting him in at flex.
Yeah, I heard today people analyzing his injury that his neck injury, I guess, doesn't have much risk of being re-aggravated. It just might hurt his longevity as a running back. So, unless you're in a dynasty league, I think that you're not too worried about him re-injuring what he's dealing with. just like in any given week this season, but I guess keep that in mind. That's disappointing for his outlook as a player. Um, but we can move on to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And in week 8, they actually, in their last game, because they were on bye in week 9, week 8, they actually coexisted and both boomed, honestly. Um,
Yeah.
22.3 fantasy points for Metcalf and 26.2 fantasy points for Lockett. Um, I mean, Lockett had an astounding receiving day, and Metcalf had a 2 touchdown uh, game. So
Metcalf played like Metcalf, and Lockett
exactly.
played above his expectation there, I'd say.
And even though this Packers defense is relatively strong, ranking 5th in total yardage allowed a game at 321 and 7th in points against a game at 20, I think with Russell Wilson back, you're back to being very confident in these 2 wide receivers.
Yeah, you certainly feel better about them than you did when Geno Smith was there.
I mean, yeah,
Uh,
the fact that they were able to put up these performances respectively in Week 8 with Geno Smith, I mean, you got to be very confident with Wilson.
yeah, certainly you feel good about it, and like you said, the Packers defense is no slouch, but Russell Wilson makes plays.
Yeah, we'll move on to the Packers. I'll say that the Seahawks defense ranks 28th in passing yards allowed per game, 273.9. So I think it goes out saying that Rodgers is a must-start QB if he's playing, and I think that's really all there is to it. I guess he's expected to be available, should be cleared on Saturday, and it's already been said by their coach that if he's available, he's playing, regardless of if he gets a practice in. I guess he probably can't get a practice in no matter what, but he'll be
Nope.
playing if he's
Yeah.
available. Um, so yeah, he's a must start in a good matchup as far as passing is concerned. Uh, I'll lump together the 2 running backs real quick. Aaron Jones, 12 rushes for 53 yards and 0 receptions. And A.J. Dillon, 8 rushes for 46 yards and 4 receptions for 44 yards, making 13 fantasy points. As I mentioned, this is Jones' first game this season with 0 receptions. I think we need a hashtag for Aaron Jones, and I'll ask you, are you concerned about Jones' usage, or is this just bad circumstance from the wide receiver dilemma in Week 8, which we analyzed before, and Jordan Love just being the QB in Week 9? Do you think that's just bad circumstance, or are you actually alarmed with Aaron Jones?
Well, I think his struggles go beyond weeks 8 and 9.
Those
I'm
were
gonna
his like
pull up
low
his.
points as far as just like compared to Dylan's usage, because I think that's even more alarming.
Well, when we talked about week 8 and the wide receiver fallout for that team, what we saw was that Aaron Jones was extremely involved in the passing game. He had 7 catches for 51 yards on 11 targets. So that usage doesn't bother you at all. The issue is this past week, really, against Kansas City. I mean, the whole offense looked pretty bad under Jordan Love. You weren't impressed by him at all. And yeah, being out carried or at least out used, I guess, by AJ Dillon is concerning. Yeah, I think that you know he's been I think he's been pretty disappointing this year. His season standing would look a lot different if you took away his week 2 game where he had 41 and a half fantasy points.
So you think he's more of a player that you would be concerned with fantasy wise more than being a buy low opportunity?
You can certainly try to buy low. I think that you may not you may not pay off as much as you think. He has a late bye, week 13, so his fantasy playoffs are Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Minnesota. So you like. Oh, sorry, actually, that's incorrect. I'm used to the 17-week format. So that would make his playoffs Baltimore, Cleveland, Minnesota, and Detroit. So Baltimore and Detroit are good matchups on the bookends of that fantasy run, or that playoffs run, rather. But then Cleveland and Minnesota in the middle, Minnesota's a good matchup.
Yeah.
So, okay, 3 of the 4 matchups are good. If you want to go for a playoffs run with Aaron Jones, I don't hate that perspective, but I think that the way he's been used recently outside of week 8 where it was more circumstance than usual, I would be a little concerned about Aaron Jones.
It's just baffling. Like whenever that they were playing behind against the Chiefs and Jordan Love at QB, like Jones, they needed to be passing and just Jones wasn't out there most of the time. It was a little baffling. Like our dad who has Aaron Jones was like, is he injured? Like what's going on?
Yeah.
It's definitely strange. Devontae Adams only had 10.2 fantasy points. He led the team in targets with 14, but did not really capitalize on them. But he's had double-digit fantasy scoring every game this season, and you expect him to be extremely reliable and back to his QB1 stat or wide receiver 1 status with Aaron Rodgers back. And the Seahawks defense is weak, ranking 31st in total yards allowed a game at 401.5. So you feel good about that matchup for sure.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the next game. Eagles Broncos. Jalen Hurts, 11 for 17, 162 passing yards and 1 passing touchdown and 10 rushes for 62 yards, making out to be 16.68 fantasy points. 2 great fantasy QBs went against each other in Week 9 when he faced Justin Herbert, but we are reminded that only one of them is a great NFL QB, that being Justin Herbert. And I guess I'll just ask you, am I being too harsh on Hurts? Or he's so hard to evaluate for me because he's got such a great floor with rushing. But how do you evaluate him?
I think you're being a little hard on him. So the next couple weeks are not great matchups. He's going against Denver this week and then the Saints the following week. But then he gets a couple of cake matchups, I feel like, in the Giants and the Jets. So
yeah,
before their Week 14 bye. We've seen Hurts be a reliable and consistent fantasy asset if you take away weeks 8 and 9. So I think he probably bounces back, maybe not as soon as you'd like him to.
Yeah.
But with his legs, he's definitely capable of, putting up points despite his passing woes. I'm not going to be as harsh on him as you are.
Fair enough. I am quite harsh on him. And like you said, this is not a good matchup against the Broncos. Broncos defense ranks 8th in passing yardage allowed a game at only 223.4. So don't feel great about that. And I'll move on to the running backs real quick because that's another area of this offense that Hurts has a lot of his value. Jordan Howard, 17 rushes for 71 yards and a touchdown. Kenneth Gainwell, 2 rushes. One of them was a touchdown. And Boston Scott, 10 rushes for 40 yards. This running back room is incredibly unpredictable, and I don't think you're confident starting any of them. Do you agree?
I kind of disagree. I think
you buy Jordan Howard?
I do a little bit. I mean, he had the bulk of the carries, and he did a pretty good job with them. He found his way into the end zone again. Obviously you don't love the matchup, but among the running backs on this team, not named Jalen Hurts, perhaps, I think Jordan Howard is the next best option to be used in this offense.
It's just so weird. I'm curious to see what happens when Miles Sanders comes back. It's just so annoying. I held Kenneth Gainwell on my team for 7 weeks just for him to get his opportunity when Miles Sanders got injured, and he's worse. It's just weird.
I held Michael Thomas for 8 weeks and got nothing. Sometimes it doesn't pay off.
It's true, for sure. And as I said before, this Broncos defense is very strong. They rank 6th in rushing yards allowed per game at only 98.3. So we'll move on to some pass catchers. Devontae Smith had a good day. 5 receptions for 116 receiving yards and a touchdown. 22.6 fantasy points. And Goddard had a more disappointing day. 3 receptions for 43 yards. So you got to keep in mind that that's pretty much all of Hurts' passing yards. Yep, that is true. That's 8 receptions between the two of them, and he only completed 11 passes. Yeah, so it comes. There's a common theme that we're showing here in terms of quarterbacks directly affecting their pass catchers. Yeah. And Hurts is one of those quarterbacks that when they don't have a lot of yardage and they don't have a lot of completions, the pass catchers are going to suffer. Yeah, it's true. Do you trust them against this Broncos defense, which is strong? I'll read some stats. Yeah, I guess you can't. They rank 6th in total yards allowed a game, and third in points against. I just want to hear you say you can't trust him against that Broncos defense.
Regardless of matchup,
Yeah.
Jalen Hurts has had standalone value as a fantasy player because of his legs and his rushing ability. And yeah, he throws the ball around quite a bit sometimes, but you can't count on these guys. I mean, there's a reason that Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert are not higher in the rankings because they have a quarterback that doesn't always find them.
It's just a really gross offense. Just in general, fantasy, NFL, don't like him.
Sure, I get it. I mean, I listen. I'm not a fan of the Eagles. The old Philly special. No, thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Move on to the Broncos. Teddy Bridgewater, 19 for 28, 249 passing yards and a passing touchdown. And this is weird. 3 rushes for -1 yards, but one of them was a touchdown. So that's good. 21.86 fantasy points. This could have changed after last night's waivers processed, but earlier this week he was only rostered in 24.3% of leagues. So I'll ask you, should Bridgewater be rostered in more?
I don't think so, honestly. Like, I mean, you can if you want, but
I think I'll say I think
Eagles,
he's proven to be reliable as a fill-in, but he's never breaking out. Like, yeah, and that percentage actually.
Sure. I think his ceiling is lower than a lot of other quarterbacks because he doesn't throw many touchdowns.
Yeah.
And in this particular matchup, the Eagles have been really good against wide receivers. So I don't necessarily feel great about starting Bridgewater this week or many of the pass catchers in this Broncos offense. I think really the value comes in the backfield with the running backs.
I agree, and we can talk about that right now. Melvin Gordon, 21 rushes for 80 yards and a touchdown, and 2 receptions for 15 yards, 17.5 fantasy points. And Javonte Williams, not an amazing fantasy day, but a great rushing day for him with 111 rushing yards, which is where he got all of his points. This is Javonte Williams' first game this season without a reception, but his first game with 100-plus rushing yards. So I guess I'll ask you, they did it last week to some degree. Can this offense sustain the fantasy value of both of them?
I think this will probably be one of the outlier games because we haven't really seen both players finish in double digits very often. It usually comes down to who finds the end zone.
Yeah.
And, Williams obviously had a great day on the ground, but like you said, no catches, and you don't like to see that. It's a tough situation. I think they both limit each other in their ceilings, but
Yeah.
for the future, I think, and for real NFL purposes, the Broncos have to be happy with how their backfield's performing because they're putting up numbers, and that's really all they can ask
collectively for. Put up 191 rushing yards against the Cowboys. That's ridiculous.
That's a good stat line.
Yeah, this Eagles defense doesn't scare you too much either. Ranking 20th in rushing yards allowed per game at 119.7, so that's lower than 191, but still a pretty good matchup. Move on to the pass catchers. This has been interesting. Tim Patrick, 18.5 fantasy points. Jerry Jeudy, 12.9. Cortland Sutton, 3.9. And Noah Fant was on the COVID list. I'll just say this is potentially the reverse ranking of how we thought this offense would operate between the 3 wide receivers. Sutton has only scored single digits in the games Jeudy has played this season. So I'll just ask you, what do you make of this offense and their pass catchers?
Well, that statistic is a little spooky if you roster Cortland Sutton, but
Yes.
it's a small sample size.
It
I
is.
think that those probably kind of, fix themselves, and you're not too worried about it. It's a weird, but it was a game where the Broncos dominated on the ground, and when that's the case, there's not going to be as many opportunities for those good pass catchers to get as much involvement. So I'm not worried necessarily about Cortland Sutton with Jeudy back in the offense. I think the most interesting thing, and maybe it had something to do with Noah Fant being absent, but the fact that Tim Patrick hasn't really disappeared like we thought he might.
Yeah, he's honestly been even more consistent.
Yeah,
It's ridiculous.
certain things have broken his way in that regard, like with Fant being out. But yeah, I think that, you know, we kind of talked about it earlier, but Teddy Bridgewater is not the highest ceiling quarterback, and that'll hurt the pass catchers all around when there's so many competing for touches, in addition to the running backs. So I don't know. It's a lot of it's a lot of mouths to feed, but there's not a lot of upside because Bridgewater doesn't throw too many touchdowns.
It's true. And this Eagles defense is middle of the road, but they're slightly easier to run against than pass against. So that's all I have with this matchup. We can move on to primetime Sunday night football with the Chiefs versus the Raiders divisional matchup. Patrick Mahomes had a disappointing day, only 10.44 fantasy points. This is Mahomes' first game of the season without an interception since week 1, so that's good to see. But Mahomes has not thrown more than 2 passing touchdowns since week 4. It's appalling.
You're at a loss for words.
I'm at a loss for words for what's happening with Mahomes. But you gotta just throw him in your lineup. I can't believe that you could almost consider benching him. I mean, you can't.
Yeah,
but you can.
There's too there's too much talent on the offense
to
be scared away from this. They're 1 week away. I feel like from getting right, and in fairness, I mean, usually there's one guy in the receiving game that does show out week to week, but it's not what you're used to seeing from the Chiefs.
That's definitely true, and this week it was Kelsey, but I'll talk about him in a second. Darrell Williams, 19 carries for 70 yards, 3 receptions for 7, 10.7 fantasy points. Williams was back to being having his undisputed RB1 status in this backfield during CEH's absence. No Derek Gore. I think he only had 3 carries. He wasn't very involved, so that's good for Darrell Williams. But CEH, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, monitor his injury status this week. I guess I'll just ask you, and this is going to be hard to predict, but what are your expectations for this backfield when CEH returns?
I believe there's going to be more involvement from Darrell Williams than we would have seen prior to CEH's injury. And I think that Clyde's value has only been diminished from his absence.
I agree. And we've talked about that before, and I think that still rings true. This Raiders defense ranks 28th in rushing yards allowed per game, 133.5, so that's good for whichever running back's getting the most carries.
Yeah, CEH is back in practice this week, so he could certainly be on the path to returning, but we'll monitor that going into the weekend.
Yes. Tyreek Hill, disappointing day, 4 receptions, 37 yards, 1 rush for -4, 7.3 fantasy points. Hill led the team in targets with 11, but was very inefficient with them. And something that was very strange for Tyreek Hill is that in Week 9, his longest reception was only for 13 yards out of all 4 of his catches. Very strange day for him, for Cheetah, or whatever his nickname is.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes, very strange day for him. But Travis Kelce had a good day. 5 receptions for 68 yards and a touchdown, 17.8 fantasy points. Kelce finding the end zone helped him have a strong day. I assume that you probably think that this is an overreaction, but do you think the best days of this Chiefs offense is in the past, or are they going to bounce back and be... I mean, they're not even in the playoff picture right now.
Yeah, it's a interesting situation that's happened to the Chiefs this season, but I think a lot of it has to do with the way that defenses are approaching their offense. I think that Andy Reid is obviously a very competent coach. He's going to figure out a way to figure this offense out, rework it, and I don't think that and Mahomes is on a max deal for like the rest of his life. So I think as long as he's there, he's not going to get worse. I think he's probably just in some sort of a slump, but they'll get it figured out. I'm not hitting the panic button on the Chiefs yet.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're definitely making the playoffs, but it's crazy that they're not even in the playoff picture right now after 9 weeks, halfway through the season.
Yeah.
But I expect them to make it. But that's interesting. Difficult division. I think that's one of the strongest divisions in the league, personally. Um, Raiders defense, much easier to run against than pass against, but we're talking about Mahomes here, so I do expect him to bounce back. We can move on to the Raiders. Derek Carr, 30 for 46. So a lot of passing action, but only threw for, 296, not bad. He's one of the passing leaders this season, which has been a strange narrative for this season, but only one passing touchdown and 2 interceptions. And he also had a fumble, so turnovers definitely took a toll on his fantasy total at 10.34 fantasy points in Week 9. Carr has yet to throw more than 2 passing touchdowns in a game this season, as we talked about before, which is just very strange because of how many passing yards he's had.
Yeah.
Very strange. Definitely worth rostering, but yeah, it's been interesting watching Carr's fantasy production this season. That's all I really have with him. Josh Jacobs, it's a good matchup, and I'll talk about that whenever I do more of an overview of the Raiders. So I do expect him to bounce back and have a more productive day against the Chiefs.
Here's the real question. Do you think he throws for more than 2 passing touchdowns? Is this the week?
I think that the whole world might stop for a second if that happens. Like, everyone might be like, huh? It's gonna be appalling. It's so strange. Like I already said, like, how is he not throwing for more passing touchdowns with this yardage? But it's reminding me of a this is how I can explain it. Carr throwing more than 2 passing touchdowns will have the same this season. Will have the same effect as Jacoby Myers catching a receiving touchdown.
Not true. Not true at all. There's way more. There's way more build up around Jacoby Myers than there's around Derek Carr throwing more than 2 touchdowns.
Yes,
that's an absurd comparison.
I mean, at the end of the day, this is a weird comparison I'm making here. Yes, Carr in the past has definitely thrown for more than 2. Jacoby Myers hasn't even done it in the past, but like I said, it's just been weird that Carr hasn't gotten it done. But whatever, we can move on from that. Josh Jacobs, Kenyon Drake, 13 carries for 76 yards and 4 receptions for 19 yards for Jacobs, 13.5 fantasy points. Kenyon Drake, only 4 carries, but for 30 yards, so pretty productive, and 6 receptions for 70 yards, amounting to 16 points. Jacobs proves to be a reliable high-end RB2, averaging 14.8 fantasy points. He's been very consistent. Drake had his most receptions in a game this season. Can you trust Drake at all? I mean, I was like very low on Drake earlier in the season whenever he would have like 3 touches and have like high double or high I want to say high teen scoring. But can you trust him? I mean, it's a more reliable stat line.
Yeah, but he's still only getting 10 touches. I mean, yeah. I think that's the metric that you got to look at when it comes to Kenyon Drake. We know that Josh Jacobs is the lead back in this offense, and Kenyon Drake is kind of getting a few touches here and there. It's kind of the inverse of AJ Dillon because of their usage with Aaron Jones. But yeah, I think Kenyon Drake can be a risky flex at times, and that's kind of how I value him.
That's fair. I agree with that. The pass catchers, Renfrow and Waller, both had good days. Renfrow, 7 receptions, 49 yards and a touchdown. Waller, 7 receptions for 92 yards. Renfrow is averaging 7.5 targets on the season and is proving to be very reliable. And Waller led the team in targets with 11, marking his first game with double-digit targets since Week 1. So both of those players are very reliable, and you trust them. I think Renfrow is a very reliable flex option, I would say, at this point, with how he's been performing recently. Real briefly, I saw that you picked up Deshaun Jackson in our league, and we've talked about him in the past. Do you think with this, I mean, this wide receiver room is kind of depleted right now. Do you expect Jackson to have fantasy value in this offense?
Honestly, I would be surprised because it was kind of a speculative ad. Deshaun Jackson is 34 years old, but he has always been a speed receiver. So those two things kind of don't line up at this stage in his career. I think that Derek Carr obviously puts the ball down the field. How he gets, that's how he gets his yardage. But I think that it will be that Deshaun Jackson will be a boom, a bust feature in the offense.
I agree. That's kind of how he has been the past few seasons as he's been past his prime. But this
Yeah.
Chiefs defense is weak, ranking 26th in total yards allowed per game, 381.4, and 23rd in points against per game, 24.6. So that makes you feel better about these Raiders offensive players. Final game, Monday Night Football, Rams 49ers, divisional matchup. We saw in Sunday night, week 9, the Rams struggled and they lost against the Titans. Matthew Stafford had his worst game of the season, but still not horrible. He was 31 for 48, 294 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions is not good. And this 49ers defense ranks 4th in passing yards allowed per game at 206.5. I mean, do you still feel pretty good starting him even in this matchup?
I do. I believe in Matt Stafford in this offense and Cooper Kupp continues to put up numbers. He's a reliable pass catcher. Robert Woods has been really solid in the past few weeks, and Darrell Henderson was banged up a little bit in this game, but I mean he's got really good options around him, and Stafford's a pretty talented quarterback. So I'm not the matchup doesn't really scare me that much.
I agree. We move on to Darrell Henderson. 11 carries for 55 yards, 3 receptions for 3 yards, 8.8 fantasy points. Sony Michel only saw 4 fewer carries at 7 and 1 fewer reception. I guess just in general, was it just a tough day for this offense? I guess more for this backfield, and are you not too worried about Henderson?
Well, yeah, that was. I mean, Henderson was questionable to return at one point in the game, and
Yeah, that has an
missed.
impact, obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah,
missed some time, and then and Sony Michel is still a very valuable handcuff in that offense because the one time that we got to see Sony Michel fill in for Henderson, it was against the Buccaneers, but which is obviously a horrible matchup, but he still did all right, and I think that in this offense, uh, the carries have mostly been going to Henderson, but it's not a complete committee either. It's a split, but it's in favor of Henderson, and so I think that given the circumstances of their game in Week 9, I'm not really too concerned with the outcome of or the outlook moving forward rather.
I agree. For the pass catchers, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, I'm so happy to see that both of them were able to have productive fantasy performances. They could coexist. Makes me so happy as someone who has Robert Woods. Cooper Kupp had 11 receptions for 95 yards, and Robert Woods had 7 receptions for 98 yards and 1 rush for 6 yards. That makes me happy. I think to me, it's been so weird because obviously you expected way more out of Woods, and no one expected this out of Kupp. But Robert Woods has been so disappointing this season, as we've talked about. But he's started to become consistent. I mean, he's only had 1 game with single digit scoring, which surprises me, and he's the wide receiver 12. I mean, I guess are you back to just accepting that he's not the best wide receiver in this offense, but he's still reliable for fantasy, and you feel pretty good about him now?
Well, sure. I mean, he's been scoring at 15 or more in the past 3 weeks, and those are good numbers from a second wide receiver option. I mean, this offense has definitely benefited from getting Matthew Stafford in the offseason, and so yeah, I think that they're starting to find their groove, and I think they're hitting their stride as an offense.
Yeah, agreed. And this 49ers defense is much easier to run against than to pass against. But this is strange. They rank 8th in total yards allowed per game at 338.1, but they also rank 26th in points against per game at 25.3. So they don't allow a ton of yards, but it's still pretty high scoring games. So, but I expect this Rams offense to bounce back from the performance against the Titans defense and just do very well, I would think. Tough divisional matchup,
Yeah,
though. So
it should be an exciting game to watch.
yeah, good game for Monday Night Football. Move on to the last team we'll talk about, 49ers. Elijah Mitchell, 8 carries for 36 yards and 5 receptions for 43 yards. As Blake already mentioned before, Garoppolo was QB1 in the past 2 weeks, which is interesting. Um, and San Francisco only ran the ball 11 times in Week 9. Something that's Something else that's interesting is Elijah Mitchell only had 4 receptions across his previous 5 games he played this season, but he had 5 in this one. Do you think this could open the door for Mitchell to become more involved in the passing game?
It certainly could, but previous performance would indicate that it's an outlier. Uh, I
It's true.
think that I think that it came down more to game script and the fact that they ran so few times. I think it was just a matter of like it just had to go that way that he got more receptions because they weren't. I mean, they had to have been throwing the ball so much more than running. I mean, they're a run based team traditionally.
Yeah. Yeah, and they were playing the Cardinals last week too, and they were completely in control of the game. So, yeah, definitely could have been game script. Rams
Yeah,
defense
yeah.
ranks seventh in rushing yards allowed per game, 99.6. So they're a tough defense for sure. But we'll talk about these pass catchers. Debo Samuel, 11.3 fantasy points, not horrible, but not the Debo we've known this season. But Brandon Ayuk, 6 receptions for 89 yards and a touchdown. And George Kittle in his first game back, 6 receptions for 101 receiving yards and a touchdown. Um, I guess going into the season, this distribution would have been the prediction. Uh, so I guess I'll ask you 2 questions. First one, do you think Ayuk and Kittle are back to their value that people thought they would be at going into the season?
So with Kittle, you certainly feel good seeing his usage. He did have a turnover in this game, a fumble lost, but outside of that, he looks pretty good. And I mean, obviously, you love seeing 100 plus receiving yards from your tight end. That's great to see. I would argue that between Ayuk and Debo Samuel, I'm not convinced on that being the case. That Ayuk is going to be better than Samuel moving forward. Samuel's just proven himself this season, and parts of last season, and Ayuk had parts of last season too, and has up until this game been pretty much worthless. I mean, we talked about dropping him last week,
Yeah,
so
I'll add on that. I don't think Ayuk's going to pass Debo, but the fact that I feel like Ayuk, it's good to see this because, yeah, we were literally talking about him being droppable, and I think he's probably moved past that. I hope that this game is not an outlier just for people that have Ayuk on the fantasy team and just for him as a player. But um, do you think that Ayuk and Kittle getting more value could hurt Debo's ceiling, or is he just too unique of a player to think that his production's gonna be hurt
well,
too much?
I think more of the concern is going to be on the quarterback situation.
Yeah,
If it's Jimmy Garoppolo and he's continuing to play well, then everyone will eat. But if Garoppolo goes back to what he's traditionally done, it's kind of problematic for probably Ayuk would be the first person to suffer because
yeah,
that's been the case traditionally this season, and then I think after that it might be Kittle who falls off because again that's the precedent that's been set this season. I think that Debo is probably the player that you're least concerned about given his performance thus far, and that's kind of how I feel about that situation.
yeah. It'll be interesting to see because this was in a tough matchup against the Cardinals last week, and another tough matchup against the Rams this week, who have a very strong defense, ranking eighth in points allowed per game at 21.1. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It should be a interesting game. That's all
Yeah,
we got.
lots of good matchups this week. I hope you guys enjoyed listening. Hopefully, you got something good out of this. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for listening. We'll
Yes,
see you
thank
next time.
you, and peace out.